The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the Nova Society are those of our guests and panel members and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of any institution any member of the Nova Society is associated with. The material information presented on the Nova Society is for general information purposes only. Reproduction or dissemination for the purpose other than education is prohibited without express written consent of the Nova Society. We'd like to welcome everyone back to the Nova Society, and today we'll continue our conversation around the recent parliamentary elections in the European Union, where the far right gained some seats and has now become a power in the European Union Parliament. And this question comes from Stephanie from New York. What is happening in the European Union, what does this signal for the far-right movement here in the United States? And we'll also talk a little bit about the Green movement and how the Green movement lost a whole bunch of seats. In fact, they were the biggest losers in the EU Parliament. So let's listen in. So this past week in Europe, this is a combination of the emails that we received, paraphrased, of course. This past week in Europe, far-right political parties won many seats in the European Parliament. Far-right parties in Germany and France gained more seats in those countries than ever before. France's president has called for new elections, which the news, and I'm assuming the news agencies, say the current president might actually lose. Now, of course, keeping in mind that he's calling for new elections, but that's not for the president. That's actually for the lower house of government in France. So the next question we got, and it kind of leads into this, we'll move to Stephanie from New York, here in the United States. Is this a signal that far-right movements in Europe might mean more far-right in the U.S.?
I think it can. I think we're there. Right?
I think we are too.
Yeah,
I think we're there.
It's very interesting how all this to me seems to feed on itself. And I mean, the same trends are evident. I was looking at, you look at Europe, for example, and the population is very much, the demography is very much the same as what we have here, with an aging population and not very many younger people to continue working and to keep up the tax base. And the older people who are retiring are concerned about the economy and the cost of items, and they simply want to have a secure retirement. They don't want to be thinking about the environment and climate change and worrying about costs and so forth. They don't want to be deprived relative to what they thought they were going to be receiving in their retirements. And farmers who don't want to be restricted in how they can farm, and young people who see their lives as being much more difficult than that of their parents, and too many rules and regulations. And that's the same in Europe, and that's the same in the United States, and people worrying about immigrants and excessive loads of people who don't look like they do, pouring into their countries and destabilizing the economies and so forth. I was thinking about Italy's leader and how she has managed thus far to increase public spending and make herself popular and cutting taxes and so on, because she's getting transfers of money from other parts of Europe. And of course, that's not going to continue forever. And saying how Rome is the capital of Italy and Rome should be the capital of Europe and all this and that. And meantime, and of course, people are cheering and yelling because they love that kind of stuff, and how Hitler was going to have Berlin be the capital, not only of Europe, but of the world. And we've got Orban, who's been in power since 2010 and has co-opted the courts and the police and everything in his country, and he's not going to step down. And if he is the most moderate among the three, and the people who don't want to think about the interests of a united Europe, but who want to think about the interests of their own countries, when the issues that are coming forward in the future are going to be far more than what one country in Europe can handle alone. The opportunities for conflict there are going to escalate as people turn inward. And we've got the same thing, of course, in the United States, where we're all going to turn inward and close our borders, and everybody else is some kind of enemy. And if they don't think the way, in this case, Trump does, then and we're not in lockstep with him, then we're somehow traitorous and committing treason. And I don't see an end to that type of thinking, really, either in the United States or once it starts in Europe. We've got people in Europe, like the Alternative für Deutschland, the ADR, the Alternative for Germany, and they are very far right. And as I understand, people are using Nazi salute and Nazi symbols and so on and so forth, and talking about Jewish cabals and global conspiracies and all that nonsense again. Or still.
Yeah,
but I think it's fear.
Well,
a lot of change. Yeah. People want things to be the way they were, where these worries did not exist. We didn't have to worry about climate change. We didn't have to worry about a lopsided demography. We didn't have these issues and problems. And so blaming the current leadership, which, I mean, Schultz and Biden and Macron, these other people did not create these problems. They inherited them. But of course, it's much easier to hear, well, of course, we don't have to, and the climate change denialism is on the rise also in the EU, as it is among the far right in the United States. Oh no, this is a hoax. Oh no, it's not real, and you're being lied to, and so on and so forth. And people are happy to hear that, because that is a huge relief not to have to worry.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on something that you just said, it does seem to me more and more that it's anti-incumbency, it's unhappiness with the status quo that is driving a lot of this, and not any kind of like particular movement. There's definitely a rightward shift. I shouldn't dismiss that, but at the same time, they're just unhappy. Even Viktor Orban was, did well, but didn't do as well as he has before. So there's signs that even in Hungary, there's some opposition coming to the incumbency, and he's been there for a long time. It's probably not real healthy.
No, it's not, and that's the problem. That is the problem you have. That is the problem that you have when you have a leadership that does not change, that stays the same. And I think the interesting thing about when we're talking about, is the U.S. going to become more far right, that will depend upon the young people. Yes, as Brooklyn says, people pine for the good old days, which, if they think about them, really weren't as good as they think they were. But the surprise in the European election was that it wasn't the old people as much as it was the young people in Europe that seemed to be moving more toward the right. I think the thing that we have to look at when we talk about, will the U.S. become more far right, I think we really have to look not to the older people. We have to look to the young people. If the young people come out, and if the young people participate in the process of the elections, and if they are, as young people have always been, they don't pine for the old days, because they don't remember what the old days were. They weren't around at the time. and they want something different than what their parents or their grandparents had. I mean, that's the way it is. That is the progression of society. It all comes down to the young, what they want to see their world look like. And if, let's say in the United States, the Republicans sweep to victory, let's say Trump, God forbid, wins the presidency. Let's say the Republicans win the House and the Senate. It is going to be either the non-participation of young people that is going to cause that, and then they really have nobody to blame but themselves if they don't like the outcome, or if the young people do participate, then we will see, are they shifting more to the right? And I think that's a question that really is going to be determined in our elections in 2024. Are those young people, like in Europe, are they? And it seems the young people are doing the shift toward the right. And I think that's one of the things that the president of France, Macron, I think that's what he's betting on. Yes, you sent them to the European Parliament, to the EU Parliament. Yeah. Most people don't take that very seriously. That's far off politics to them in Europe. They really take seriously what's going on in their country. And I think Macron is betting on the fact that, that was a protest vote that caused that. Here in France, they're going to say, no, we want nothing to do with it. Because there was an interesting thing that came out on Deutsche Welle, the news agency out of Germany. They had the head of one of the economic think tanks there, and his comment is that it's going to be bad for the economy if the far right takes over, because the far right promises things, cuts taxes, does all these things. Yep, short term it sounds great, but long term not so much. Italy was one of his examples. When he says, yeah, right now Italy's doing great, but as has been pointed out, Italy has also raised its debt ceiling. That's not sustainable. Much of the income that Italy is getting is from other EU nations. So that's not sustainable. So when that bubble bursts, now where you go? And I think that's why they consider the Italian prime minister to be a little less far right than, say, Le Pen, because I think she's going slow. I think she is going much slower than Le Pen would go. Le Pen would just burn the house down and just change it all. I think the prime minister in Italy is going slower than in other countries, and we'll see how that works. Again, to me, it all comes down to young people.
So I agree with you that it's going to come down to young people. Young people are going to have to come out and vote. What I'm not sure I agree with is the left-right paradigm. I'm not sure that I think that there's a mix there that is not necessarily what we think of as being left-right. And we've talked about how that's changed in the United States anyway over the last, 8 years or so. And what has happened more so, I think, and I'm going to base this on a couple of anecdotes, not proof, okay? But I think it's something worth looking into.
Yep.
Is a sense that young people are feeling more lawless than they have in a long time. And my assumption here is that the lawlessness from the top, right? The perception of young people that their leaders, their national leaders, are lawless is driving them to be lawless. And I feel, looking back on my own life, that when after Watergate and Vietnam and all the things that we discovered about those two in the early 70s, as I got into high school in the mid and late 70s, that we were very much unmoored from rules, willing to cheat on tests and other things. In New York City, there was a big scandal when students stole the Regents exams one year.
I remember that.
And we provided them to everybody. So all kinds of stuff like that. And like I had a friend who had a shirt that he made up that said, "I cheated on the regents," and very proud of it. Nowadays, what you're seeing is, and this is an anecdote. I met with a friend of mine who's a judge yesterday, and he said that young people are shoplifting, like crazy amounts of shoplifting, and nobody is stopping them from doing it. My own daughter, I just found out, routinely jumps turnstiles in the subway of New York, to which we said, probably shouldn't do that. And she said, they're asking way too much money to take that stupid subway. I'm not paying it anymore. And so she's willing to jump the turnstile and not pay the fare. So I think that there's a sense of like, from young people, that they're being failed by their leadership from the top, and that they're acting out because of that. Again, this is very anecdotal. I don't have numbers to back myself up here. I may actually begin to look into this a little bit more, but that's what that's a sense that I get. And people are, again, very unhappy with their leaders all over the world, not just here, not just in Europe, all over the world. People are unhappy with the current leadership. And a lot of that is, there are a number of things, right? But the wars are definitely a part of it. You would think that the United States was at war ourselves, the way people are talking about these wars, and not just supplying weapons to one side of the war, of each of the wars, that we're actually sending troops and we're deeply involved. You also see migration is the biggest by far in Europe and in the United States. Migration is the biggest issue, which is what, and Biden finally caught on and decided to take a far right approach to immigration, which is probably going to fail in the court the same way that it did when Trump did it. But you see the things, some of the other things are these, like all the political correctness turns people off. All the gender stuff turns people off. There was a big thing this week about young men and their inability to have relationships with young women, or their disinterest in having relationships with young women because they just can't bother or don't want to deal with the rejection that we certainly, or I should say I certainly had when I was younger, had to deal with rejection. They don't want to deal with that, so they don't play the game. All of these things are of a piece that sort of signals a dissatisfaction with the way things are.
Yeah, I totally agree. And yes, rejection is one of those things. And that's also the work of a relationship. I think, a lot of these young men just don't want to have to go through the work of the relationship. And to your point about, the leaders being lawless, we always understood, everybody always knew in the United States, politicians are not the most honest people on the face of the earth. But it wasn't so much out there. It wasn't so obvious as it is today. And then taking the Trump 34 felony convictions, and then having other leaders say, "Oh no, that's okay, that's all wrong." And I think that gives young people the sense that, well, wait a minute, if they can do it, why am I playing by the rules? If nobody else is playing by the rules, and this stuff is obvious and it's out there, and it's the system's manipulated, such as the documents case, which should have been brought out a long time ago and should have been adjudicated a long time ago. Well, look how this has been, held up and so on and so forth. And I think people, young people are getting that sense of, what, the old system isn't really very good. And now we're seeing, everybody knew that Richard Nixon probably was dishonest. Even when he came out and said, "I'm not a crook," which is usually the first sign that you probably are a crook. But, again, to save the presidency, he left the presidency and it was all kind of swept under. Nobody liked it. Of course, that's probably one of the reasons Gerald Ford did not get reelected. That's why they elected Jimmy Carter. But the fact is that it wasn't as overt as it is now. The concept that the United States of America, when we're talking about are we moving more far right, the concept that the United States of America at some point in time would put a convicted felon, whether you agree with the conviction or not is irrelevant, that we would actually entertain the idea that a convicted felon could be the president of the United States. That was unthinkable.
Mhm.
And I think that young people see this and say, wow, the world's lost its mind. And they'd be right to say such a thing.
I was also thinking about the youth and the voting. And as I understand it, the Green Party, the so-called Greens in the EU, lowered the voting age in the European Union to 16. So for this election in June, with the idea, presumably, that the youth would be voting Green. And so 16 and 17-year-olds could vote for the first time.
That didn't happen.
No, it did not. And the fact that the Greens lost, to me, is deeply alarming, given global changes that are. Once we in the planet and we who live here reach a point of no return, there will be nothing we can do. And people, I think, fail to understand that, as well as the complexity of. I believe the Japanese built a supercomputer that was finally completed in, 2015 or something like this, that would indeed be a viable planetary climate and atmospheric model, and could actually model this stuff. And it took a long time to build, because the complexity of atmosphere and climate and the biosphere and so on and so forth is immense. And at some point, the oceans are not going to be able to absorb any more carbon. Then, if we think people are dissatisfied now with the incumbents, we will really find out what dissatisfaction looks like, and then we really will have conflict and chaos.
Climate change is already moving people all over the globe, right?
Oh, it is, but it hasn't affected enough people.
Well, the problem with the Green Party has always really been that they're one issue thing. I mean, they're one issue. I mean, the environment, that is their main focus. And there are a lot of other issues that exist in the world today. And even the mainstream parties do have some green agendas within their platforms. So, the Greens still matter. There's no doubt about it. But you're not going to have a Green Party running things. That's not going to happen, simply because they have really their platform, their agenda doesn't address all of the other things. They're a one issue party. And the more of the green ideology that gets into these mainstream parties, the more seats the Greens will lose. And yes, the Greens were the biggest loser in the EU elections this year.
But we should point out that even though they were, yes, and Macron's and Marsh Party and the German Green Party lost seats, the Greens lost seats, they still have 132 seats.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty powerful.
Out of 705, that's a little bit more than a fifth.
Well, the amount of, people don't understand the amount of money and public investment and the amount of time that projects take, injection of hydrocarbons and transformation of the infrastructure to handle electric cars and electric vehicles and homes that are all retrofitted. This is going to be an enormous investment that the petroleum companies knew about since the 1970s easily, and chose to lie to Congress and chose to keep quiet about. So we've had all this time where everything could have been slowly changing. and being taken care of. And of course, instead, we chose to ignore it and continue to invest in death through petroleum geology.
Well, Stephanie, in answer to your question, is the U.S. going to be moving far right? I would have to say that the panel would say we are already pretty much there.
We're there,
and now it's going to be we're going to have the tail of the tape will be in November when we see which party actually gets into power. And I think the real thing that pollsters really ought to look at when we're looking at stats, and everybody loves stats, where those young people, where they're coming down on the fence. I think that's probably the number one thing we need to look at.
Well, we also need to be aware of the purging of voting rolls and like the Republicans' lawsuits. If you look at Democracy Docket, for example, which is available on YouTube, you can also sign up for a free newsletter. The lawsuits in various states, such as Nevada, that are challenging the voter rolls and saying that various people shouldn't be on the voter rolls because they've moved or they've died. And very often, apparently, that means purging the voter rolls. So people who believe they are, in fact, registered to vote are no longer registered to vote. So people are being disenfranchised without knowing it. And paying very, very careful attention and making sure that if you believe you are registered to vote, that you are in fact registered to vote and are able to vote. That will also make a difference, so that you do have the right to vote.
Use the technology.
Yep.
It's all right there. Oh, you go right on your computer, on your phone. You can register to vote. Use the technology that young people seem to love so much. Yep. And instead of FaceTiming with somebody for 30 seconds, go on to voter registration and make sure you're all caught up. So yeah. So that's it for Stephanie. So that's all the time we have for today's episode. The Nova Society is a production of the Phoenix Research Institute. We'd like to thank our sponsor for this episode, the Journal of Interdisciplinary Conflict Science. The JCIS is an open journal for upcoming scholars. The JCIS is currently accepting article submissions on an ongoing basis. The JCIS is a publication of Nova Works, a scholarly depository at Nova Southeastern University. A link to the journal is in our description. We'd also like to thank our podcast partners, Buzzsprout, who hosts the Nova Society, Audacity, who is our editing partner, and Podkite, who does all of our analytics. We'd also like to thank iHeartRadio, where people get their music and podcasts, Apple iTunes, the largest source for music and podcasts on the internet, Spotify, the most popular source for the Nova Society. The Nova Society is available on all these and other quality platforms mentioned in our description. We'd also like to thank our listeners. Without you, the Nova Society would not be possible. If you have a comment, a question, or would like to be a guest on the Nova Society, we can be reached at nova.society.podcast@gmail.com. Always remember, the power of society is knowledge. So for Dr. Scott Gershwer, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, and all of us here at the Nova Society, I'm Dr. Mark Bound. Be well, and we hope to see you again next time.